Hello again. In this episode, we will take a look at collections and CEL. We will use them to split the assets and create separate render layers. There's a lot you can do with collections. You can have them sit directly under the assets and drive your material assignments, optimizations, anything that could be useful to you. First, make a collection create node. Place it anywhere in the node graph as long as it falls after our geometry imports. In location, indicate the placement of the collection in the scene graph. By default, the collection is placed at /root. Now make a collection for the characters. In name, we can call it characters. We can now see the collection appear under root. In its parameters, you have a CEL parameter. You'll see this across many nodes in Katana, and there's a lot you can do with them, but we'll look further into this later. Click on Add Statements, and you can access scene graph locations using paths, collections, and custom statements. How you use them can become very powerful, but let's first go through what each of these options do. Paths will take in absolute paths from the scene graph, so you can drop elements in by selecting your path and middle mouse button drag them into the cell. Shift select and control select paths to drop in multiple paths at once. You can also select Add Statements, append scene graph selection to add a selection to the list, replace with scene graph selection to replace the cell with your current selection. We can therefore place both paths for our characters into this cell. Let's assign a new collection for our props. Repeat the previous steps, then create a custom CEL statement. Before we go further, you can refer to the documentation on CEL reference under Help Developer Guide. This is well documented and can show you what can be done with this custom parameter. For now, we'll use a basic expression and type in root world geo //prp star, which will look through everything under geo that begins with prp. I'd recommend being as specific as you can, since this can become quite an expensive operation if you're searching across all the geometry in the scene. In this case, we've picked up not only the assets under prop, but also some under character beginning with the same string. Again, being more specific would have prevented this from happening. Instead, we could use the expression root world geo prp /star, which is going to access all locations one step below prp. We're going to split our location elements into foreground and background. In this case, the table and microphone will be in the foreground and the rest in the background. First, we'll create two new collection nodes. Name the first one Studio Foreground and the second Studio Background, and open both their parameters. Remember, if you hit Ctrl E over two nodes, it'll expose parameters for both of them. Place foreground elements, such as the table and the mics, into the corresponding collections in the form of paths. We are now going into the use of booleans in CEL. For background elements, we want this cell to include the difference between Lock Studio and the cell in the previous node. What you can do to speed up the process is to copy a CEL statement from one node to another. This is useful for collections that take a lot of time and effort to set up. In Add Statements, copy CEL statement as text, and then in the other collection, paste CEL statements. Now add a custom statement, root world geo lock studio /star, and we will subtract the path statement from the custom statement. Use the double arrow icon to drag the custom statement above the path statement. On the right, toggle from union to difference. If you click on the arrow and see what the cell is calling, you'll find that we've subtracted one from another. We now have everything we need to create our render layers. I'll go through the process for one render layer and let you create the others. Copy and paste the DL settings and render nodes we already have, and place them in the node graph, branching off from the original render settings above. In between them, add a DL Object Settings node. Untick Visible to Camera, and this node removes the object's visibility to the camera, but allows for it to still impact shadows. When looking in its parameters, you'll recognize that this node takes in CEL statements as well. In fact, you'll see this in many nodes, such as material sign, transformation, attribute set nodes, and this is where collections can be useful. They prevent repetition when making the same selection in the scene graph. Imagine you are referencing your props in lots of nodes within your node graph, and you want to change the path for that asset, or add a new asset that isn't in the same place as the rest. Using a collection enables you to only make this change in one place and have it referenced throughout the node graph. This branch now represents our background layer, so let's remove anything that's in the foreground. We can add statements, collections, and drag in our predefined collections. This includes props, characters, and studio foreground. If we preview render from this branch, our background is now isolated. We can now repeat the process for the other two render layers. Once done, we have our background, foreground, and character layers. Because the character and foreground interact with each other, we'd want the foreground layer to include holdout, so cutouts of the characters. This will make the compositing process a lot easier. In the DR object settings, we will tick visible to camera and set the compositing parameter to matte, which will set those characters to black while preserving the way they interact with light. Make sure you have backdrops to state where which layers are. Next, we will look at the group stack and group merge nodes.